Welcome to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast, addressing all aspects of the digital enterprise, inspiring connection without boundaries and creation without limits. Thank you for tuning in. Here are your hosts, Thom Singer and Craig Brown.
Hey, and welcome back to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Thank you so much for coming along on the journey of this show that has been designed to be a resource for those who work in and around PLM. The Digital Enterprise Society, it is a forum for the exchange of ideas surrounding the tools, processes, and practices used across the product lifecycle. To learn more, visit digitalenterprisesociety.org. My name is Thom Singer, and I have the honor for the last year to co-host this show with Craig Brown, an industry veteran and former PLM leader at General Motors. And today, Craig is my guest on the show because we've been doing this now for 13 months. And Craig, he is a veteran. He's been doing this for a long time. And I actually thought it would be fun to talk to Craig about the changes he's seen in this world of PLM and to kind of see what has he learned from hosting this show and all of the guests that we've had. So, Craig, how you doing today?
Doing great, Thom, and thanks for inviting me as a guest. This will be fun. You have to worry about all the administration. I just worry about answering your questions.
I know. Usually I just kind of kick things off and let you be the smart questioner, and now I have to actually do the whole interview. So who knows what's going to happen?
That's right.
So Craig, let's go backwards in the career of Craig. I don't know if everybody knows where you started. I know that it wasn't in General Motors. It wasn't in cars. I think if I'm remembering correctly, it might have been in aerospace. But let's go back to the early days of your career.
Well, so I'm old enough to remember the moon landing in 1969.
Wait a minute. I'm old enough too, but I was 3 years old.
I was old enough to remember and talk about it, Thom. I was born and raised in Western Ohio, not too far from where a guy named Neil Armstrong was born and raised. And so, as with many of us in the Midwest, we kind of aspired to the whole NASA thing and what's the next thing? And of course, the next thing was something like the space shuttle. And so I went to school to be in aerospace, especially NASA. And when I graduated, we had changed in our country. We were no longer really pursuing space. I mean, there was the space shuttle program that was just starting, but in fact, the defense built up and the Soviet empire, which people don't talk about anymore, and the United States were at odds with each other. Anyways. So the work I started doing, I went to school to do NASA work. I came out of school and I did stuff that was really cool that I couldn't talk about. And it actually frustrated me to no end. And I did that for a few years in the aerospace industry, in the defense industry. And then the company I worked with that I got with as a co-op student, they actually did work not only with aerospace and NASA, but they also did work with a car company. And it was kind of odd. And it's like, well, why are we doing work with a car company? That's kind of cut and dry, right? And it turned out the car company was starting to put digital computers, like a flight computer, into cars. And they admitted they didn't know the first thing about that. So they were asking the people they worked with on the Apollo space program. So a lot of people don't realize the car companies worked on the space programs. They did.
I don't know. Anyways, I don't know that I knew that.
Well, the rover for sure was a GM co-invented thing. But the flight computers on the lunar module were, in fact, assembled. They were programmed in Massachusetts, wires, not digital components. This is before there were digital components. And they were installed in a GM factory in Milwaukee, of all places. And if you ever get to that plant, you can still see a sign on that wall. From these walls came the flight computers that landed on the moon, which is kind of cool. Anyways, that was the connection. And it's one of the first things I learned in my career was connections come from all kinds of places. And this connection was a bunch of people from MIT and a bunch of people from General Motors knew each other. And so they said, hey, we're getting into this space. Well, for the next few years, the company in Massachusetts and the folks out here in the Midwest, we developed systems to build embedded software. And so for the next, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, I moved from aero into auto. That's how I got to auto. And auto is all about bringing this large company into the era of doing digital controls. Mm-hmm. And so this is not a computer design thing that's coming later for PLM, but this was just how do we use computers to control your car?
And it must have actually been a fascinating time. I'm kind of doing the math of sort of what year that all would be. Must have been a fascinating time to be in the automotive industry then, because of all those changes that were coming. I mean, the way cars evolved during that time.
It was a blast. And if you ask me, well, what's the one thing that defines your career of over 40 years? The application of computers to anything. Mm-hmm. And this is deeply embedded computers. The customer doesn't know the computer's there, right? The computer's replacing mechanical systems that were failing.
Now, I guess in cars, we now know that our cars have computers because our cars are talking to us. But if you go back to that era, we didn't know our cars had computers in them.
Yeah, the first computer elements in a car actually were in radios, and it was for warranty reasons. And then the second place was in fuel control, and it was to help with emissions, right? Mm-hmm. And then the evolution, diagnostics, and then everything in the car. And now you're talking about autonomous vehicles and all the rest. And it's funny that people asked me at one point, well, when did cars overtake flight controls in a fighter aircraft in terms of amount of software? Well, that was, I don't know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It wasn't that long ago, but it's been amazing, the explosion of software in a car. Right?
So what brought you to the world of PLM then? How did that? Well,
like anybody, you get tired of doing what you're doing and you want to do something different. And so I had an aerospace degree, which aren't that common in the car business. So the first step was we want to do more simulation and less physical tests. And so for a few years, I did methods development. And in that era, I got to know some of the simulation companies that are all part of computer-aided engineering. And then one of the things that frustrated me was that the embedded software community and the simulation community were way underserved by this group of people called PLM. And by underserved, what I meant was they just didn't acknowledge it. They thought the center of the universe was mechanical parts, and therefore everybody should just adopt their PDM system and life would be fine. And I kind of came to the game and said, well, wait a minute, there's other things to consider. And that's what led to my assignment at GM as the PLM leader. And that's what I did the last 10 years. So that's roughly 40 plus years and three major assignments: embedded software for control systems, and then simulation. Let's do it with more computers. And then how do you do the bigger enterprise with product lifecycle management?
So in that 10 years that you were working for General Motors in that PLM role, how did PLM change? What are some of the changes that came down?
Well, one of the most frustrating things is the vendors, solution providers, we often call them, would say, I got the whole tool set, just buy my tool set and off we go. And so we did a fair amount of benchmarking of the incumbent, of others, and we do that. And most really good companies do this. You do competitive benchmarking every, 3 to 5 years. And then if your incumbent gets better, great. And if the incumbent falters, then you switch horses, right? That's kind of the game. So I learned that nobody had a real competitive state-of-the-art PLM system. And some companies, whether they're aircraft or car companies, some had built really extensive internal systems, and then they were in the process of going commercial. So let's no longer build a one-of-the-kind that only we use. Let's share, if you will, the development cost with our competitor across town. Let's use the same tools. And so tools became less a discriminator between one company and another company, which of course is not what the tool vendors want to do. They want to be the reason you're successful, right? And so maybe the second learning was, it's more than just tools. It's also process. It's also the skill of your people. And this is something the leaders in every industry, they know this. They know they got to know the skill of their people, and then they got to know what are their processes and how quickly can they adapt their processes. So it's not just tools. There's a friend of mine who's also retired. He and I are kind of doing some work together now. And Bill always loved to challenge me. He said, you're the tool guy, Craig, and I'm the process guy. And have I convinced you yet that process comes first? It took until I was, it was about 6 years ago, actually, the middle of my PLM assignment, that I realized how important process was before tools. And it kind of makes sense, right? One of the themes we ran across in our podcast this past year was theory of constraints. And there's a classic set of stories about, you buy this brand new piece of equipment, a tool, and you try to optimize everything around that tool. And in so doing that, you find out your factory's not any better. And why is that? Well, it's because it's not about the tools. It's about the flow. It's about the process, right? And so, you learn over time. Sometimes you have to have the lesson repeated. I did. That it really is about process and then the technology that's out there. So figure out your processes and then figure out the tools. Now go back to your PLM vendors and say, well, here's what I'm missing. Here's my gap. Here's what you haven't filled yet. Let's have a competition about that. And it's been interesting to see who wins. And it's not always the same company. It depends a lot about your enterprise and what you're trying to do. But, I kind of wish I was still working in the car business, because this whole thing with electric vehicles and autonomous and just fast forward to today, shared products like Ubering and the lifting. Mm-hmm. Wow. I think COVID's going to affect that. Somebody needs to invent a product that instantly fumigates a car, right? That way you can still share it. But anyway, my point is it's an interesting time to be in the products business, and PLM is it's integral. Even our friends in the Department of Defense have made it clear that a digital engineering strategy is not only required, it's essential to remain the technological leader that we're used to being. And so those out there still wondering, is PLM important? Absolutely. It might be a well-worn term, but bringing all these tools and methods and processes together, it's really the key to staying competitive, staying above your competition.
So you retired when? When did you leave GM?
So I left GM, the date says February 1st of 2019. It was a buyout program that often occurs, right? Sure. So I didn't need to work, and so I didn't. We bought our retirement house, and I worked on making it better, because like all things that you buy, they're used. They need some tender loving care. But at the end of that summer, so August, September, I had started podcasts with you guys. Some friends that evolved PLM world thought this would be cool, so we tried it, and
here we are.
Momentum. I remember you and I were in San Diego in August, I think it was.
Yep.
And that was about the time I started to do some part-time work for people.
Well, I think I've made the joke. I think I've made the joke a couple of times in the last year that you're horrible at retirement, because not only did you retire, and like a month later we started production of this. We didn't launch it till June, but we started the discussions around March. So you were like a month retired, and suddenly you were becoming a podcast host, and then you started consulting. You're like the worst retiree ever, because you've got a whole bunch of irons in the fire. But
so I beg to differ. What the real issue is retirement as defined is just stupid, right? I mean, sure. So what did I retire from? I don't have the crazy commute. I don't have the office politics. And I get to work on what I want to work on. But when you stop that daily grind, especially, I think engineers especially, but maybe all professions, you still want to share what you know with folks. As long as you're relevant, right? So it's been fun to have the year or so to visit with people that I've visited with over the years and share experiences. And some of the tool vendors, as well as others, they've called and said, hey, well, we'd like your opinion on this. And that's been a lot of fun. So will that all go away someday? Oh, I'm sure. And it's fine. When it does, right?
So in the last 13 months, we've been doing this show. I come from outside the industry, so I'm constantly learning about everything to do with PLM, but you've lived in it for well over a decade. So I wanted to ask you, when you look back at the, nearly 60 shows, 50 plus shows that we've done, I want to ask you a couple questions. What's the most memorable show to you of all the ones that we've done? Who stands out and why?
Well, so I thought this theory of constraints thing was largely automotive, right? And I think we were interviewing a gentleman from Western Digital. So they've been around in the computer industry from the beginning. They built different kinds of disk drives over the years, right? And so I was fascinated. At first, we were talking to a manufacturing guy, and which is kind of neat. And what were we? I don't know, 10 minutes into the interview, and he brings up this point about theory of constraints. And well, as you recall, maybe we went off on a tangent that and before long, we were talking about books and so on. I got more feedback from that session of people that said, "Hey, thanks for the reference. I read the book. I get it now." And so it's interesting to me that and most memorable that somebody else, a completely different industry, in fact, the computer industry of all industries, who knows about Moore's Law and all that stuff, was using the same book to make their manufacturing efficient.
So I do remember that, and I laugh when you said you went off on a tangent, because you've done that with a lot of guests, but always in a good way. I mean, it's always fascinating, but I do remember that one, and you guys got really excited. So
yeah.
So I guess another question then is, what's the most insightful interview that we've had?
Well, so there's a theme that's come up in a few interviews, maybe a half a dozen of them. When we ask people, what's the career advice? And it's not industry specific and it's not role specific. Almost all of them said, the people with curiosity, if you have an unbound curiosity, you will be successful. Don't get waylaid by politics or other issues. Just stay curious. So I found it insightful. And when I thought about my career, you asked, why did I do these 3 different jobs? Well, a little bit of boredom, and I was curious. So let's go try something else, right? So I think the thing to take away there is be curious, stay curious. If you find out you're not curious anymore, might be time for a change.
Well, and that has come up in a lot of our shows. I know that because, one of my mottos in what I teach is try new things. In fact, this is an audio podcast, so nobody can hear it, but I'm wearing a shirt right now that says try new things. And so
you didn't mean try a new virus, did you?
No, not trying.
This was extreme, Tom.
It had nothing to do with new ways of needing to quarantine. It was before that. But okay. But I've always, I think curiosity is a big thing. And I've always been happy because that topic has come up so many times with the people we've interviewed and the career advice they've given. And so I guess the last question is, has there been anything that's really surprised you? What's the most surprising interview that we've had?
So there were 2 of them, and they were at the same event. It was when we were in San Diego, and we were doing different companies, right?
Yeah, we did. And we were at the IPX event, and we did like 8 or 10 sit down face-to-face interviews instead of doing them over Zoom like we normally do.
And there were 2 of them, and maybe it was because we were face-to-face, or maybe it's just because I was ignorant, but there were 2 of them that just surprised me. They're competitors, Facebook and Microsoft, and they both talked about why they needed PLM and all the things we talked about with PLM for replicating server farms across the world. And it just never dawned on me that, I'm thinking about new product introduction, right? A new car, a new plane.
Yeah, coming out of manufacturing, you were thinking of it from that way, right?
Yeah, so these people are using the same tools, whether it's the platform tools like Eris or the turnkey tools like what Siemens has or the others. And so it's interesting, they were all using PLM tools to roll out a new server in a new location in the world based upon human consumption of bandwidth. Everything about Facebook, everything about Microsoft and Azure and everything Microsoft's trying to do. And so it just was interesting. And it was fascinating because guess what? The theory of constraints came up again, right? It's just like, oh yeah, and then we got to apply our constraint models, and then we go off and we make sure we learn from each event and then apply it to the next factory we built. And they're rolling out everybody should know this, but you wonder where you get all this capacity to do texting and IMing and Facebooking with everybody. It's because they're building server farms like 1 a month somewhere in the world. It's just amazing what they do. So they needed PLM to do that. I never would have guessed.
Well, and that was when I knew I'd been paying attention at least a little bit as your co-host, because when I saw that we were going to be interviewing somebody from Microsoft, I thought, why are we interviewing a software company?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's like even I knew why this. So,
but their revenue, the revenue in this world has changed from a license for some software, which is what we all think, right? To what? To bandwidth. Mm-hmm. They're selling you time on a network, right? And so you pay, look how you pay for your devices. You're paying for the right to use the network. You're not paying for the right to use the software. The software is almost becoming free,
right?
Not really free, but it's free, right? And so it's an advertising platform, which I hate, right? And everybody's doing it, including car companies, but I hate it only because it's distracting, right? I'm an engineer, so if I sit down to use a tool, I want to use the tool for its intended purpose. I don't want to be given a tomato soup commercial at the same time, right?
So, Craig, one thing I always do at the end of our shows is I always like to go back to the guest and ask them, because you'll talk tech, you'll get deep into the tech with a lot of these guests, and it might be a little over my head, but I always like to take the guest back and say, here we have an expert. We have someone who's succeeding in this vertical, in this world of PLM and the related areas. And I always like to say, so that's great that you talk technology, but so what? A lot of the people who listen to our podcast, they're up and coming in their career. They're trying to get established. They're trying to figure out, where do I go from here? What career options do I have? So what career advice do you have for someone who's listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast who, maybe they've been doing this a few years, but they're in their 30s or their 40s. They have a long way to go. What advice do you have?
Well, first and foremost, stay flexible. None of us are good enough to plan when we're in our late 20s or our even our late 60s, what the next step's going to be, right? And so first, be flexible. And then this whole curiosity point, when these people we interviewed pointed this out, it dawned, and I hadn't really acknowledged it, but it dawned on me every time I took on a really different job, different kind of responsibilities or a different role in the company. It really was because maybe I was a little stale. And so if you feel you're getting stale, you owe it to yourself and to your loved ones to take the risk, try something different, right? The old adage of, I'm an organization man and I'm going to do the same thing for a long time, and then I'm going to retire and go play golf and not do what I'm doing right now. It isn't real. I don't think it's been real for quite a while, or typical at least. And so what do you want to do instead? Well, whatever it is, put your heart into it, stay curious, and don't be too afraid. It hardly ever doesn't work out, right? You do have to get well prepared, educated. I would encourage people learn more about processes and people interactions and less about tools. The tools in PLM land, they're all getting pretty good, right? What's needed now is, how do you and I achieve something together when we're 800 miles apart? Well, Zoom helps. We're using Zoom right now, right?
Absolutely.
But tomorrow, when we're trying to help with whatever the next challenge is in our society, it'd be really cool if we could do it safely and quickly and profitably, so that we can pay for our livelihoods.
It's interesting because if everybody is listening right now, I think they need to rewind about the past minute and a half and listen again to what Craig just said. You listed a bunch of things and you just kind of blew past them, but you said, hey, stay curious. Taking my word, you didn't say this, but you sort of implied, try new things. Make sure your heart is in it. Don't be afraid. Get educated. Be prepared. Learn the tools. And it's all about relating with people. And here's why all those things stood out to me, and I was feverishly writing them down as you were saying it. When we started this podcast, I had been podcasting for 5 years. I have a successful show. It used to be called Cool Things Entrepreneurs Do. Last week, the name of the show changed to Making Waves at Sea Level, as in the C-suite. But it's the same show, and I've been doing it for almost 600 episodes. I knew how to be a podcast host. You had no idea. And yet I didn't know
True. That's why I needed your help.
Well, I didn't know the technology. And so I didn't feel comfortable jumping in and doing the interviews at the level that you've been able to do them for the last year. So when we started talking about the show, and you and I had known each other for years from my involvement speaking at several conferences in the field. When we started talking about it, I was like, God, can Craig do this? And I don't mean that in a
well, it's okay. I had the same thought.
I don't mean that in a bad way. I was just thinking, wow, this is out of his comfort zone. Yeah. You know, we talked about going and buying a microphone, and it was like, after that conversation, I thought, uh-oh. However, you were very curious about doing it. You wanted to make sure you got the right thing. You wanted to make it work. You wanted to make sure the bandwidth was good in your house, how we were going to do it, how Zoom was going to operate. You were totally willing to try it and took all the advice that I had, and I think you talked to some other people as well. I got to say, your heart was into it. You never seemed afraid. You certainly got educated about everything that we had to do, and you were prepared. You learned the tools, and you and I had a good relationship already. We were able to play off that, but you're really good when we sit down with the people because you can relate to them. You've been able to get everybody to open up and share their thoughts about their career. So all that advice that you've given everybody is exactly what you have done in the last year. So I got a big smile on my face when you were saying that, because I'm like, he lives this stuff.
You know, Thom, there's one last thing that maybe I should leave with everybody, and I feel pretty strongly about it. So somebody will accuse me of being political, but I firmly believe in building bridges and not walls. And I think if we would all do that a bit more, take a chance, build a relationship, listen to each other carefully. We all have got important ideas and important things to say, and it takes time, of course, but it's usually time well invested to learn what's on each other's minds. And then from there, build together, you know, make that bridge and cross it a few times. And I am so disappointed sometimes in our current situation here in the United States, because we talk so much about walls. And I don't mean just political, I also mean just groups of people. And I think if the people listening would start, let's just promise that you'll go build a bridge. Yeah, build a bridge or two, and we'll be much better off.
Well, I mean, I've built my whole career teaching people that it's more important to connect with people than it is to, you know, avoid those connections. And it doesn't matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert. You never know. I mean, I kind of have this idea in my mind for another book I want to write called A Pattern of Circles, because as I get older, I keep seeing this pattern of circles. People keep coming back into my life. People invite me to come and speak at their companies who I met through weird situations 4 or 5 years ago. Opportunities come up for me in my career. Now I'm working in executive search. I'm already starting to find some career opportunities from people who I'm connected to from some other things. And so it's this big loop of circles that keep coming around. And I think it comes back to that fact that if you're open to building those bridges and growing with people, you never know who's going to come back around. And it could be a little circle. They could come back around next week and bring you an opportunity. Or it could be a big circle and they come back around a decade later. But I think it matters. So I think you're right.
Well, and I think, Thom, that's great advice. It's kind of back to you really can't predict a 40-year career. And how many of us back in January, now maybe a couple people because you were tuned into world events, but how many people in January thought right now we would be spending 90% of our time or more isolated physically from each other and learning how to use tools like Zoom and podcasts and many other things to stay connected. And it's even more important. Here we sit at the end of June of 2020, and it's really important that we keep connected as we get through this next phase. And be flexible, everybody, and be hopeful, and we'll get through this. And then on the other side, to your point, Thom, the circles will connect even more, and we'll be doing more podcasts. It'll be interesting to see where we go.
I'm looking forward to it. It's been a great year for me. It's been so much fun. My hat tip to you, Craig, for being my partner for this for the last 13 months, and to everybody who's tuned in and listened. Every now and then, someone will reach out to me on LinkedIn or by email, and they like the show, and that kind of makes my day. And I know you hear, because you're more connected in that world, you hear from more people than I do. So I just thought it would be fun to sit down and talk to you, since usually you're the one trying to get everybody else to share. So thank you for jumping in and doing that today. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened. That's why we do this show. It's for you. So join us next week, because every single week we're going to have more thoughts, ideas, information all around product lifecycle management. The Digital Enterprise Society is the place for the exchange of ideas around digital manufacturing tools. Go check us out if you haven't. digitalenterprisesociety.org.
You've been listening to the Digital Enterprise Society podcast. Learn more about what you've heard here today at digitalenterprisesociety.org. Join us again next week for more connection without boundaries and creation without limits.